dealing with the whole we were without internet actually in my office yesterday too, all day.
All day, yeah.
But the rest of the campus or the rest of the department had it.
Okay. Okay.
Cool.
All right. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Before we get started, can I just say one thing, which is I was telling Diego that, he that last Thursday, obviously, right? No internet, no nothing, no, like, oh my gosh, like, how do you do this stuff? It's very visual, right? And especially a lot of stuff we were doing is pretty visual. So I said to Diego, I said, I'm so sorry that you had to deal with that without any. And then on the other hand, I'm so glad you had to deal with it because everything else will seem much easier now. And so it's amazing when that stuff doesn't work. And we start to realize how much we rely on all of that. Okay, good. Anyway, good morning. Welcome, everyone.
How's everyone doing today? So far, so good? Awesome. All right, so just wanted to touch base on some of the stuff that we reviewed last time, last Thursday. And we'll start with the one thing that I want you guys to take away and remember about the mobility, stability of the joints, right? So can anybody tell me what they noticed based on what we talked about last week in terms of stability, mobility of the joints? Anything that pops out, that stands out from that, from this image especially?
You have a question in your lab about this.
Yeah. So think about what did we say? Do we want stability or do we want mobility first? We want something to be stable, right? So a nice stable environment. So if you look at it, the foot is the most stable, right? If you don't have stability on the foot, okay, then everything starts shifting back and forth, right? Especially like, let's say, for example, a squat. Okay, you're going to be rocking side to side, forward, back. Okay, and then you go into the ankle, and then you have mobility, right? So you have two mobility joints next to each other. You're already rocking back and forth, right? Side to side. Now the next joint is also mobile, right? So then you got, it's going all over the place, as Ellen has mentioned. It's kind of like those car dealerships, right? Those little moving balloon things. Yeah, so that's pretty much what it's, the takeaway here is that you have to have, it's stability, mobility, stability, okay? Then mobility, right? So the hip is very mobile, and then stability, mobility, stability, mobility. Okay, got it? Cool, awesome. And then we talked about the sliding filament theory, right? The sliding filament theory. Two things, right? Troponin, tropomyosin, right? And actin, right? So we talked about that, and this is the video that I wanted to show last Thursday, which helps it kind of like, bring it home, truthfully, because it's one of those things that where you get to see it in action, and so I'll play it for you guys, and then we'll talk about it briefly. If you guys have any questions.
Is the mechanism by which muscles are thought to contract at a cellular level. An understanding of the structure of skeletal muscle is useful when learning how sliding filament theory works. Each muscle is made up of a number of bundles of muscle fibers. Each bundle of muscle fibers contains anywhere from 10 and 100 individual fibers. Each muscle fiber itself contains cylindrical organelles known as myofibrils, which themselves are bundles of proteins called actin and myosin. Surrounding the myofibril, there is a network of tubules and channels called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, where calcium is stored. Each myofibril can be broken down into functional repeating segments called sarcomeres. If we look at a two-dimensional model of a sarcomere, it consists of actin and myosin. When a nerve impulse arrives at the muscle, it causes a release of a chemical called acetylcholine. The presence of acetylcholine causes depolarization, enabling calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The calcium binds to troponin, changing its shape, and so moving tropomyosin from the active site of the actin. The myosin filament can now attach to the actin, forming a cross bridge. The breakdown of ATP releases energy, which enables the myosin to pull the actin filaments inwards, contracting the muscle. This occurs along the entire length of every myofibril in the muscle cell. When an ATP molecule binds to the myosin head, the myosin detaches from the actin and the cross bridge is broken. When the ATP is then broken down, the myosin head can again attach to an actin binding site further along the actin filament and repeat the process. This repeated pulling of the actin over the myosin is often known as the Ratchet Mechanism. This process of muscular contraction can last for as long as there are adequate ATP and Ca+ stores. Once the nerve impulse stops, the Ca+ is pumped back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the actin returns to its resting position, causing the muscle to lengthen and relax.
So as long as there's ATP, and ATP is energy, right? So as long as there's energy and the muscle, you would be able to continue to contract, you know, and relax that muscle tissue. So when we talk about marathon runners, right? Why is it so important for them to be able to, or to rehydrate, okay, put more energy into their systems, right? Why? Because we want to make sure that energy storage is continuous in there, okay? So main driver in that is sugar, right? So that's why you have those pouches. Endurance runners, I'm thinking here. Endurance runners, they have like those small pouches of a lot of sugar, right? That they can go in and then just chug it down with some water, right? Maintain that hydration. Talked about calcium, right? That's the main driver. So when people taking calcium supplements, mainly one of the main reasons why. Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Ellen?
Just with calcium, one of the issues that comes up, and we see this in persons who have eating disorders. And so we oftentimes see with persons with eating disorders where they may have limited food intake, particularly calcium, right? When we see limited food intake, then calcium levels decline. And oftentimes we may see someone who is very physically active, but with low calorie intake and low calcium intake. And so what happens is the muscles will steal the calcium they need for contraction from the bones. And that leads to osteoporosis, that leads to bone breaks, fractures, etc. So, you know, the muscle is going to get that calcium, because if it doesn't have calcium, actin and myosin can't bind.
Keep the dumbbell close to your chest.
So you know, especially when as Ellen was mentioning, so there comes a time where, you know, when you're about to recommend supplements to folks, right? There's a perfect example of, you've got to be careful of what it is that you're recommending, right? If you're allowed to recommend, given your knowledge base, right? So just lastly, the muscle movers. I know we talked briefly about the agonists, which agonists are the prime movers, right? So there's the ones that are going to be doing a lot of those major muscles. So like hip extension, the glutes, right? So the glutes, and a lot of times we think about the quadriceps, because we tend to train what we see, right? So you see a bicep, that's what you want to train, right? But now, what is extending that elbow, right? So we know what contracts the elbow, right? Which is a bicep, right? So in extending the elbow, the tricep, right? Synergist muscles assist those prime movers during movements. So the hamstring and the rectus spine, usually when there is hip extension, right? So hip extension, so I'm extending the hips. So the rectus spine comes in, and I'll play a quick video on that. And then the stabilizer muscles, mainly, those are the ones that are called the core musculature, right? So the core muscles transverse abdominis, internal oblique, multifidus, they stabilize that pelvis, the hips during hip extension.
Can I give an example?
Yep.
of that? So for those of you that are in the 143 class, one of the exercises that we did today, right, we did the extension, opposite arm and leg, right? So we had hinging at the hip, right? And then we're really activating erector spinae, right? So we're activating that to keep the spine stable. And so as we're extending, right? So I've got the agonist muscles that are extending. The antagonist muscles are relaxing in order for that movement to take place. But my spine has to be stable. My hip has to be stable. So those stabilizers are actively engaged in stabilizing those joints so that now I can flex and extend opposite arm and leg. All right, so I have agonists that are moving. I have antagonists that are relaxing in order for that movement to take place. And then I've got stabilizers that are keeping those joints stable so that I can engage in that activity. Make sense?
Cool. All right. So let me show one real quickly on something like this, where it happens. So a barbell squat, right? One of the most common exercises that we do.
Rotated externally. The knees
Okay.
move in a straight line toward.
So the agonist is will be the quadriceps, right? In this movement here. Okay. And as we move
We can
around,
see the assistance of the adductors. The adductor magnus, pink, assist in hip extension, and the other adductors, purple, serve mainly as stabilizers.
so as we were talking about, right, transverse abdominis, this whole area here is acting as stabilizers, as well as these adductor magnus, these adductor complex here is assisting. Also, look at the bottom of the leg here, right? It's got that's going to be another antagonist.
Keep your back straight throughout the movement.
So we look at the back side of the hamstring, right? So a lot of times, again, we train what we see. So people say, well, I'm going to train my quadriceps. I'm doing legs only, right? No. Look how much that tissue is in terms of the amount of force that it has to generate, okay, to generate power, okay, and to generate force, power, and stability as well.
Erectors are active in full coordination with the other core muscles.
You can see there also that the spine is stable. The lumbar spine is stable while the hip is mobile.
So when, as Ellen was mentioning, right here, see that? This musculature right there. All right. You guys get that point
Quadriceps.
of the agonist, antagonist, prime movers? Yep. Everybody good on that? Okay. Anything else, Ellen, that you want to add on this, on just to wrap up the muscular?
Probably maybe just two things on here. One is, do me a favor, take one arm, I don't care which one it is, extend your arm out, contract your bicep and your tricep at the same time, and try to bend your elbow. Right, you've got to contract at the same time, really trying to bend your elbow. Can you do it? No, why can't you do it? Right, you have two muscles contracting in opposition. Right, the bicep flexes the elbow, the tricep extends the elbow. So if they're both engaged simultaneously, I don't have any movement. So while the agonist muscle always contracts, the antagonist muscle has to relax. Otherwise, that movement doesn't take place. So they're synergistic. They're working together to create movement. Does that make sense? Right. So while one muscle, if I flex my hip, my gluteus has to relax in order for the hip to flex. So we're going to talk later on as we get into something called reciprocal inhibition. That's where one muscle contracts signal goes back to the central nervous system that tells the other muscle, hey, relax. I'm trying to move here. You're in my way. Right? You're opposing me. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
So would then a cramp be like a failure of that information? So that like both muscles are like contracting at the same time?
Could be, we have that kind of thing that takes place. Oftentimes, a lot of cramping and that sort of thing is neural fatigue, right? And so you start to see muscles that are not getting the right neural input. And so maybe you've got two muscles that are getting the same neural input, right? The same contract input, right? So the cramps are oftentimes related also to either like weather conditions, right? So you see sometimes in the heat, right? We've got more dehydration taking place and that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot of study looking at why do muscles cramp. And a lot of it used to be thought that this was mostly chemical. And there's a lot of work now looking at that, how much of that is neural. Basically that the nerve is firing in a way where, like tetanus, right? Where it just locks down and it's not relaxing in between. So hard to say on that, but unless you want to add something to that.
No, that was exactly, so a lot of times when we talk, we look at neural fatigue, right? What are the things that you need in order to present stimulus to, you need chemical, so potassium, calcium, in order to generate that, those signals to carry through, and hence hydration, right? The conductor of electricity is hydration. So there's plenty of literature out there that goes into. I don't think there's a definitive answer, but there's lots of theories for sure. That's good.
And the only other thing I just wanted to, the only other thing is looking at this concept of motor units. So let's take this room, for example, right? So we have 3 lights, right? Or actually 9 lights, right? These 9 lights are controlled by this wiring system. So I can turn off all 9 lights at the same time. I can turn on all 9 lights at the same time. So I've got basically one wire that comes up here, goes to each of these 9 lights. Make sense? So that is a single motor unit. All 9 of those lights are exactly the same, correct? We have a second set of lights up here, right? So this is also a light. In however many years this has been here, I've never figured out what it's for and why it exists, but it's there for some reason, and it's controlled here. This is a second motor unit. Make sense? Different wire. Does that light look different than the other ones? Right? So in this room, if you were to consider this room a muscle, we have 2 types of muscle fibers. We've got these kind of more rectangular ones, and then we've got this long skinny guy. Make sense? So the lighting system in the room is heterogeneous, right? It contains 2 different types of lights. But a motor unit is always homogeneous. That light switch will never turn on these 9 lights. That light switch will never turn on this light, right? That light switch, those 9. That light switch, this 1. 2 different motor units. Make sense? So a motor unit is always homogeneous, but a muscle is heterogeneous, right? So your bicep muscle, heterogeneous, has both type 1, type 2 fibers in it. So which fiber I recruit is going to be based on what's really needed. Does that make sense? Questions on that? It's a pretty trick little system, right? It's a pretty trick little system. Clearly, for me to do this bicep, curl of a few ounces, I don't need very many motor units. But if I'm trying to lift Diego's cup, right, or if I'm trying to lift, say 50 pounds, I've got to recruit a lot more muscle fiber. Does that make sense? So we need a system by which your brain can recruit those muscle fibers. And it does so using this thing that we call the size principle. And so the size principle basically is saying that we recruit motor units, based on the size of the motor units. So basically, type 1 fibers, right, slow twitch fibers, they don't develop much force. And so type 2 fibers, right, your power fibers, they develop more force. So one of the motor units is going to be all type 1, or it's going to be all type 2. And so how many do I need to recruit is going to be dependent on, am I picking up a small weight or I'm picking up a big weight? Does that make sense? So we recruit based on the size principle. Smaller units are recruited first, bigger units are recruited after. And it makes sense, right? If I only need a few, imagine if I had to pick this up and my brain said, well, let's use them all. Boom, right? So all of a sudden I've got way too much force for this tiny little glass. That makes sense, right? So that's how we recruit those muscle fibers on there. So basically, when we start to work with clients and we're doing strength training and resistance training, your brain gets way better at picking those motor units and picking those muscle fibers, right? That's what motor learning is. It's your body's ability to pick the right motor unit at the right time in the right sequence. And your brain just gets way better at that. So we continue to practice with those things. So is that making sense on there? Right. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool little system to be able to do that. Okay, I think that was it. Yeah. Okay, so let me get out of this. Okay, so we're going to go to a different topic. But what I want to do is this in teaching, we call this whole part whole. W-H-O-L-E, part W-H-O-L-E. So I'm going to show you the whole cardiovascular system. Don't take any notes, just absorb it. So we're going to give you it's about 11 minutes of, it's a boatload of information, right? Don't panic. We will then break it down into its segmental parts. And then we'll put it all back together again. Okay? So as I said, don't panic on that. All right. Now, I will say, if you want to videotape this, feel free. The problem is we can't send you the link. So.
The best gifts come from the heart, and blood is, in fact, thick.
All right.
The best gifts come from the heart, and blood is, in fact, thicker than water. But why? How do these systems work, and why are they so important to our overall health and fitness? Well, let's find out. The cardiovascular system is comprised of the heart, blood, and blood vessels that transport blood to and from the heart and tissues of the body. Let's dive a little deeper into each of these. The heart is a muscular pump that rhythmically contracts to push blood throughout the body. It is positioned obliquely in the center of the thoracic cavity, in front of the spine, posteriorly and slightly to the left of the sternum, with the lungs on either side. The heart is approximately the size of a typical adult fist and weighs roughly 10 ounces. While skeletal muscle is primarily voluntary muscle, cardiac muscle is involuntary and not typically consciously controlled. The heart has 4 hollow chambers with 2 interdependent but separate pumps on either side. Each each side of the heart has two chambers, an atrium and a ventricle. The right side of the heart receives deoxygenated blood from the body that is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. The deoxygenated blood is then pumped to the lungs to be saturated with oxygen. Conversely, the left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs that is high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide, which it then pumps out to the rest of the body. The atria are two smaller chambers on top of the heart. They gather blood returning to the heart like a reservoir. The right atrium gathers deoxygenated blood returning to the heart from the body, and the left atrium gathers oxygenated blood coming to the heart from the lungs. The two ventricles are larger chambers on the bottom side of the heart. The right ventricle receives the deoxygenated blood from the right atrium and then pumps it to the lungs to be saturated with oxygen. The right ventricle has thin walls and pumps under low pressure because it only needs to pump blood a short distance to the lungs. Once the lungs oxygenate the blood, the left ventricle receives the oxygenated blood from the left atrium and proceeds to pump it through the entire body. The left ventricle has thicker walls and pumps under high pressure because it pumps blood a greater distance out to the rest of the body. Each chamber of the heart is separated from one another by a one-way valve to prevent a backflow of blood back into the chambers. The heart has its own built-in conduction system that rapidly sends an electrical signal throughout the cardiac cells. A resting heart rate, also known as a pulse, means the number of times the heart contracts per minute while at rest. Though they can range dramatically, resting heart rates for most people are between 60 to 100 beats per minute. The body will increase its heart rate in response to exercise or physical activity and will lower its heart rate during deep sleep. The electrical conduction system of the heart is made up of specialized cells that allow an electrical signal to be transmitted from the sinoatrial or SA node through both atria and down into the ventricles. From there, the electrical conduction system of the heart stimulates the heart's myocardial cells to contract in a regular rhythmic pattern, often referred to as normal sinus rhythm. The SA node, located in the right atrium, is known as the pacemaker of the heart because it initiates the electrical signal that causes the heart to beat. The internodal pathways transfer the impulse from the SA node to the atrioventricular or AV node. The AV node is located between the atria and ventricles and delays the impulse before allowing it to move on to the ventricles. This delay allows the ventricles to fill with blood from the atria prior to contracting. The amount of blood pumped out of the heart with each contraction is referred to as stroke volume. The end diastolic volume is the filled volume of blood in the ventricle before contraction, and the end systolic volume is the residual volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after ejection. The stroke volume is the difference between the two. The average resting heart rate for an untrained adult is approximately 60 to 100 beats per minute. Levels below 60 BPM are referred to as bradycardia, and levels over 100 BPM are referred to as tachycardia. Cardiac output, sometimes just called Q, is the volume of blood pumped by the heart per minute. Monitoring heart rate during exercise provides a good estimate of the amount of work the heart is doing at any given time. Some well-conditioned athletes or clients may have a slower than normal resting heart rate as a result of those activities, improving the heart's ability to pump blood. Let's look at blood in more detail. Blood is the life-sustaining fluid that supplies the body's organs and cells with oxygen and nutrients, helps regulate body temperature, fights infections, and removes waste products. Blood consists of cells suspended in watery liquid called plasma, which also contains nutrients like glucose, lipids, proteins, hormones, clotting agents, and other molecules. There are three kinds of cells in the blood that correspond to blood function. Red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs throughout the body. White blood cells help fight infections, and platelets assist with clotting and contain growth factors, which may help in healing after an injury. Let's look closer at the support mechanisms of blood. blood transports oxygen to bodily tissues and transports waste products to other regions of the body. Blood also stores, protects, and transports hormones to other parts of the body and transports nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract to organs and tissues. Last but not least, blood stores and transports cells that help the body heal when injured, like stem cells. Blood helps regulate body temperature. As blood travels close to the skin, it can either be heated or cooled, depending on the external environment. Blood is also essential in the regulation of pH levels, or acid balance, as well as maintaining the water content of body cells. Finally, blood protects itself from loss through its clotting mechanism, which seal off damaged tissue and forms a scar. It also provides specialized immune cells to fight against foreign toxins within the body, which help to reduce the risk of disease and illness. It's the blood vessels that allow blood to be transported to and from the heart through a closed circuit of hollow tubes. There are three major types of blood vessels: arteries, which carry the blood away from the heart; capillaries, which are the exchange sites of water and chemicals between the blood and the tissues; and veins, which carry blood back to the heart. The largest artery in the body is the aorta, which carries blood away from the heart. The branches of the aorta include medium-sized arteries, such as the carotid artery, which supplies blood to the brain; the subclavian artery, which supplies blood to the arms; the mesenteric arteries, supplying blood to the digestive system; the renal artery, which supplies blood to the kidneys; and the iliac artery, which supplies blood to the pelvic and reproductive organs. These medium-sized arteries further divide into smaller arteries that are called arterioles, and eventually into microscopic vessels known as capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels in the body. They serve as a connection point where arterioles transition to venules and the sites of element exchange between the blood and body tissues. Some substances, like water, can both enter and exit the capillaries. Other substances can only enter the capillaries from body tissues, like carbon dioxide. And some can only exit the capillaries into body tissues, like glucose and oxygen. Growth factors from the platelets assist with both the formation of new capillaries, or vasculogenesis, and the formation of new capillaries from existing vessels, or angiogenesis. Vessels that collect blood from the capillaries are called venules. Capillaries merge to form venules, which progressively merge to form the larger veins. Veins then transport all of the blood from the body back to the heart. As blood passes from the extremity veins toward the heart, special valves prevent a backflow of blood. Blood pressure is the measurement of blood circulating against the walls of the arteries. Blood pressure measurement results are based on a person's cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance would be increased if the arteries were constricted and decreased if the arteries were dilated. Systolic pressure is the pressure in the arteries when the heart contracts. Diastolic pressure is the arterial pressure during relaxation of the heart, when the heart fills with blood between beats. Normal blood pressure is classified as a systolic pressure of less than 120 millimeters of mercury and a diastolic of less than 80 millimeters of mercury. Someone with elevated measurements is said to have high blood pressure or hypertension. There are various stages of hypertension depending on how elevated the measurements are. We spend a lot of time protecting our hearts, so it's nice to know our cardiovascular system is working just as hard to protect us and keep us moving and functioning efficiently.
Wow.
I know, is your head spinning? Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. So we're gonna break it down for you so that you are, able to see what's happening with that. And I just realized that we are not sharing our screen. Okay, so let's go to here. Okay. Okay, so let's go to this. All right.
Can I put the lights up or is that good? Down lower?
Okay. So a couple of things here. All of that, there was a ton of information. Give you sort of an overview of some things, but basically, we're going to give you the Reader's Digest of what it is that you really need to know. So I want you to keep this in mind. The cardiovascular system, or what we call the cardiorespiratory system. So as an exercise physiologist, as a person who does personal training, you're going to be focusing on this element, cardiorespiratory endurance. So this is how much oxygen a person can get into their body and utilize in a particular amount of time. But it's dependent on the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system and their work simultaneously to give us the energy that we need to do work. Does that make sense? Right, so it's two systems, and you have to pretty much know what each of them are. So you're going to hear Diego and I say this over and over and over and over again. So I want you to get this in your brain. Exercise programs should always be safe, but effective. Are finger push-ups safe? Am I going to hurt myself doing this?
No.
Yeah, probably not. So this is safe, but it's not very effective, right? If I want to improve my fitness, I'm not using very much muscle mass. Make sense? So we always want exercise programs to be safe and effective. Nobody goes and hires a personal trainer. Nobody goes to the gym and go, I cannot wait today to waste my time and get nothing out of this. Right? We're always looking for some opportunity to improve. But we want to make sure that we're not putting someone in harm's way. And this is especially true when we're talking about cardiorespiratory endurance, because the #1 killer in the US, what's that? Cardiovascular disease. So lots of what you saw in that video is how a healthy body functions. But you can also see there are so many elements where things could go bad at any moment along the way, right? Okay, so cardiovascular system, basically we're going to be talking about the heart and the blood vessels and the blood. The respiratory system is looking at the airways and the lungs. So basically these two systems function to do basically a couple of jobs. One is transport oxygen to all the tissues that need it, and the other is to pick up the waste products and get rid of them. So you're going to hear me say also this thing, the issue is in the tissue. So at the end of that video, one of the things they were talking about was growing more arteries. Sorry, not arteries, growing more capillaries. So basically, we train people, we talk about heart rate all the time, but what's really, really, really going on is improvements at the cellular level. Right, so a lot of cellular physiology that's happening. So that's basically the role of these two systems, is basically oxygenate and bring nutrients, and then take the waste products away where they can be expelled. Did any of you know that you expel CO2? Right, so you take in oxygen, but you breathe out CO2. Right, I don't know what, how humans, I don't know what our contribution is to global warming, but, I'm sure we're in there somewhere. I mean, at least on the breathing end of things. So we won't do too much of this now, but just know that there are several names that we call this system, cardiorespiratory system. So we call it cardiorespiratory endurance. Athletes talk about max VO2. I'm sure at the Olympic villages now, they probably have a lot of athletes going, hey, what's your max VO2? Right? It's not what's your sign, right? What's your max VO2? Right? VO2 max, they also mean there's aerobic fitness, aerobic capacity, is basically looking at the combined capacity of these two systems, the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. So your heart has 4 chambers, right? It's the size of a fist, right? It's right underneath your sternum, slightly to the left, right? Breastbone, slightly to the left. Basically, you've got the right side of the heart. You saw in that video that the heart basically has 4 chambers, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, a right side and a left side. Sorry, right side and a left side. And so as you look at those, the right side of the heart is the pulmonary circulation. The left side of the heart, we call it the systemic circulation, because that's what pumps all the way to the rest of the body. Right? Don't get too hung up on that. You should just know that there's 2, you know, basically you've got 2 little race tracks, right? You've got the short track and then you've got the long track, right? So you've got those 2 things happening at the same time here. So if you take a look at the heart, again, we said that there are 2 major chambers. We've got the right atrium and the left atrium up on top. And then on the bottom to complete those 4 chambers is the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Here's the big take-home message. Did you notice in that video, they talked a little bit about, look at the wall of the right ventricle. See how much thinner the wall of the right ventricle is in comparison to the wall of the left ventricle? Do you guys see how much bigger the left ventricle is? Why do you think the left ventricle is so much bigger? Why do you think the thickness of this wall, remember this is a muscle, why do you think that muscle is so much thicker?
Bigger, going up to the body.
Yeah, it's got to pump to the whole body. The right side only pumps to the lungs. That's a pretty short distance. But the left side's got to pump that blood to the brain, to your toes. Right, so this one is big. So why do I mention that? Because when people have coronary artery disease, when people have heart attacks, when people have issues with the oxygen supply that supplies this part, if the left ventricle is damaged in a heart attack, then the ability to pump oxygen to the rest of the body is compromised. And you can imagine what that means. That means I can't do the activities that I normally would do. Even if I survive that heart attack, if this is damaged, it's not coming back. Yeah. Does that make sense? So that's why protecting that left ventricle is really, really, I mean, protecting all of it is important, but that left ventricle is really important. So again, here's your pathway, it comes in basically from the head and the upper body, from the lower body on the right side into the right atria, into the right ventricle, gets pumped out through the pulmonary artery, gets back in there through the pulmonary vein into the left atria, the left ventricle, and then out the aorta to the rest of the body. There is a thing where people have, there's a disease called Marfan's disease. We see it in people that grow very tall very quickly, where this aorta can be damaged. It can be essentially stretched. So when people have an aortic aneurysm, that's when the aorta bursts. That is bad news. That person needs a serious medical attention immediately. Most people don't survive it, right? Because major artery. Did you have a question, Adrian?
Yeah. What are some ways to prevent it from being damaged? Just eating better, or?
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about heart disease prevention, but yeah, absolutely. So we want to protect the arteries. We want to protect the interior walls of those arteries. So not smoking, big one. I mean, if you want to damage your arteries, smoking is a good way to do it. Looking at lower fat and cholesterol diets, although that's becoming a bit more controversial, but essentially reducing stress, reducing blood pressure, anything that really puts a load on these vessels. Okay, so if we take a look here at kind of a schematic of this, right? So here's the right side that's going to the lungs. Here's the left side that's going out to the rest of the body. So you can see we pump blood up to the head, back to the lower body. We exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. We exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in the tissues. So the issue is really in the tissues. This is where all the action takes place, is in the capillaries, right? So the more oxygen you can get out into the tissues, the more they can use, the more physically fit you are. So this system, you can see it's a closed loop. So it just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going and going. Aren't you glad you don't have to think about your heart rate? I'd imagine if you did. So again, just a larger schematic here. So we inhale fresh oxygenated air, right? We get that oxygenated air out to the lungs, to the body. The body exercises it. We use oxygen, we use ATP, we produce CO2. That carbon dioxide then depleted, carbon dioxide rich, but oxygen depleted blood then gets returned to the lungs on the left side through the, or on the right side through the right ventricle. And then we exhale CO2. So we inhale oxygen, it runs through the system, we exhale CO2. And the more we can use that system, the faster we can use it, the better that oxygen carrying capacity. Okay, electrical system of your heart. So you will work with clients that have things like atrial fibrillation, that have preventricular contractions. And basically, these are things, these are heart diseases where the musculature is fine, the valves are fine, but the electrical system, right? Same thing, your heart has an electrical system, just like your muscles do. If that electrical system is in any way impaired, it impairs the rhythm of your heart. So you guys know that, right? Your heart, the atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, right? Beat, 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 beat. So when your heart beats, it happens because of this electrical system. The pacemaker of the heart is this thing right here. We call it the SA node or the sinoatrial node. It's basically in the right atrium, and that's the pacemaker. So that's the one that says we're beating at 60 beats a minute because we're sitting in class and I'm not really doing much of anything. Or I'm beating at 120 because I'm late for class and now I got to get there and I'm walking pretty fast. Make sense? Right, so that pacemaker, it gets its information from the vagus nerve in the brain that basically says, hey, speed it up here. Oh, slow down, we're not doing much of anything. So remember how we talked about the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system? You had the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. That's what's controlling your heart rate. The sympathetic speeds it up. The parasympathetic slows it down. And they work in balance. They're constantly sampling what's needed. So this SA node then connects then to what's called the AV node. This is the atrioventricular node, basically AV because it's between the atria and the ventricles. So that's why it's called the AV node. And it distributes that same electrical impulse down the center here. This is basically, these are called the bundle branches. You've got the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch. And then they come up here and they innervate each of the ventricles. So that your ventricles squeeze from the bottom, push the blood out the top. It's kind of like a tube of toothpaste, right? Squeeze from the bottom. Don't you hate people that squeeze from the middle of them or squeeze from the top, right? Right, squeeze from the bottom, pushes everything out, right? Just like that tube of toothpaste. This has nothing to do with this lecture, but doesn't this look like a little face right here? Yeah. I know when I looked at it at first, I'm like, oh, that's kind of ghoulish. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Yeah, kind of weird looking. So basically what you need to know is your heart has an electrical system. It has a pace that it goes at depending on what the activity is. Your nervous system and other things, right? Fight or flight, right? I perceive something that is scary, like maybe that thing, right? My heart rate goes up. Right? So this electrical system can be damaged. And when it's damaged, usually we prescribe medication. A physician would prescribe medication. So for example, if you have a client that's on a beta blocker, that beta blocker will artificially slow this rate. By the way, beta blockers wildly prescribed, very expensive. They're used quite a bit in blood pressure regulation. So they can artificially slow that heart down. So a couple of terms you should know. Bradycardia means your heart rate's below 60. Tachycardia, so if a physician says somebody's tachy, they're not referring to their sense of style, etc. They're referring to an elevated heart rate. Tachy means above, Brady means below. Slow, fast. So,
If I may.
yeah, go right ahead.
On bradycardia, I'm gonna, just a reference to Tom Brady, because he's always calm under pressure.
Common, I thought you were
So-
gonna say Brady Bunch.
No. So that's my reference. And Brady, meaning he's getting older, so he's slowing down. So therefore, there's it's the lower part of the spectrum there. So that's how I was able to remember it when I was in school. Hopefully that helps.
Sure.
And then tachycardia, I didn't quite come up with one, but I remember back in the novelas and you know, back in the day. Anybody know novelas? Heard of novelas? Yeah. So they'd be like, oh, córrele, you know, hurry up, you know, you're having a tachycardia, you know, and then it was always that. So I always remember it like córrele and tachycardia. So that's how I remember that. That was the only thing that I could reference to. So
It's good. So let's do a little thing here. You're gonna take your own pulse, and we're gonna see where you are. So when you take somebody's heart rate, right, you always want to use your index and middle finger, right, because they're very sensitive, right? You've got a lot of nerve endings in there. You can detect pressure. So along your thumb line, so not over here by your pinky, but along your thumb line, you have an artery, right? This is called the radial artery. And if you find that radial artery, everybody feel that? If you don't feel that, you can find your carotid artery. Two big arteries that feed your head, right? They come right off the aorta. So if you find your larynx, that's your Adam's apple, you should find a good pulse there. Now, the one thing is that you always have to press down because blood vessels are pliable, right? Think of it like a garden hose. So if I want to feel the blood that's rushing through there against my fingers, I have to push a little bit. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to just take your heart rate. We're going to do it for 10 seconds. So find your heart rate. Make sure you find a good strong pulse. Everybody have one? Well, I know you have one. Sorry. You don't have one, we're in trouble. Adrian, you're good with it? Okay. On your mark.
I got it.
Okay.
On your mark. Set. Go. Go.
Okay, so write down what you got. Right, and that's in beats per minute. Right, and then multiply that by 6 because you did it for 10 seconds, right, which is 1/6 of a minute. Multiply that by 6 and see what you get. By the way, practice taking heart rates. This is an important skill you're going to need to know. Practice taking heart rates. Okay, what kind of numbers did we get?
66.
Okay, 66? 90, okay. 70?
It's a negative.
90, okay. Right, pretty normal, right? So usually between 60 and 90 is normal. 90 is anything over 100, if it's resting, would be tachycardia. Okay, now do me a favor. Get with a partner and introduce yourself if you don't know them. We're going to do this again, but now you're going to take your partner's pulse and you can do it simultaneously. Okay? All right, so go ahead and partner up.
You write it down or just
Yeah. Okay. So first thing, find their, so is it okay if I touch you? Right? Is it okay if I touch, well, tell them where you're gonna touch, right? Is it okay if I touch your wrist? Right? Go ahead and find their pulse.
You do it at the same time, do one
Well, you can, we'll do them separately.
separately. I do want to go first.
All right.
Okay.
So you're gonna count for 10 seconds. You can go ahead and count on your own,
Whatever.
right? So you want to use a clock.
You want me to time, I can time you count.
There's a clock right there. Oh, sorry, never mind, I forgot. Yeah, so use something on your phone.
All right, you ready? You have it? All right, 3, 2, 1. Oh, am I supposed to tell you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize you were looking. I
Sorry.
no.
Okay, try again,
You can do
try
it again,
again.
yeah. I'll let you know, I'll let you know. Yeah,
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. That's it.
12.
12, all right, so that'll be, okay, all right.
Okay, did you practice on each person?
Yeah.
Great.
Was it hard?
No.
Easy?
So how was it feeling their pulse? Was it a little bit harder to find?
No. I think it was easier.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit easier. Sometimes it's easier if it's a little bit more surfacey or it's a little deeper. So sometimes, you gotta, we call it palpating, right? You have to kind of dig around in there nicely, right? Without scraping there.
And so, just very
Yeah.
quickly on that note, you guys have really strong pulses there, right? So that's probably one of the reasons why it was easy. But the majority of clients that you're gonna deal with, might have a faint heart rate, okay? So they might not be able to find it quite as easy as you did right now. So that's why, and when I was mentioning practice doing it, mom, dad, roommate, just get comfortable with doing it, okay? And the more you do it, the better you're gonna become at palpating and figuring out where it's at and the best landing spots where you can actually do that.
Yeah, it's definitely, this weekend, can I take your pulse? So you'll be a popular person, right? Okay, so just quickly to finish this up, 3 major types of blood vessels. And you can see again, the system is set up where deoxygenated blood goes from the right side of the heart to the lungs. It gets oxygenated, it comes back into the lungs and then goes out to the rest of the body, right? Where it gets utilized and then we pick up waste products along the way. So you've got all these different vascular beds in the body that perfuse your brain, that perfuse the abdomen, that perfuse your legs. So just recognize 3 major blood vessels. Arteries. Arteries always take blood away from the heart and they carry it to the tissues. Carotid artery, brachial artery, femoral artery that serves your legs, right? So these are big arteries. These are surrounded by muscular tissue. They're surrounded by smooth muscle so that they can close down or open up. You ever been out in the cold, right, and your hands get really cold? Right, so your body is trying to keep the blood warm, and so it's going to shut down some of those arteries, close them down to their minimum if you're not really using those hands, right? So arteries have a capacity to shunt blood to different places. So for example, when you exercise, the blood flow to the spleen, to the GI tract is slowed, but it's going to pick up going to the legs, right? So you have one blood supply, but your body can move it around and give more of that portion to a particular area. That make sense? Right. So that's the job of the arteries, carries blood away, but these are surrounded by a layer of smooth muscle. Veins, no smooth muscle. They've just got those little valves in between, and those veins then carry blood back to the heart. And the way they do that is by muscular contraction. So if any of you have been in the military, right, people have to stand at attention for hours on end. blood pools in their veins, and then they faint. So they teach soldiers to isometrically contract their legs to push blood back to the heart, which pushes it to the head. Right? So you want to make sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Just like talked about that if you're getting cold, like the blood does not get transported there. Does it also work the other way around? So if you have like, because yesterday I had like breakfast 2 hours in the heat, and then I got a headache in the evening. So does it also work the other way around, that if the blood is too hot, it does not get transported to the brain to like not cause an overheating?
I wouldn't say it doesn't get transported to the brain. It is going to get transported to the brain, but your body's going to try to bring it to the surface as much as it can. So blood is going to be more to the surface of the skin. It's going to get shunted there so that you can transfer that heat from the blood to the environment. Yeah. The headache was probably more related to dehydration, which you see more commonly in the heat, right? You sweat more. And so if I'm more, so if I have more moisture going out than coming in, I'm going to get dehydrated. So here's the big thing. The issue is in the tissues, right? These are the smallest blood vessels where oxygen and CO2 and other nutrients are exchanged. Exercise, or especially aerobic exercise, allows you to build more capillaries. That is a big time adaptation. We build more capillaries. Your body says, hey, I have more of a capacity to use oxygen, but I need a roadway to put it, I need a pathway to get it there. So your body grows more blood vessels. We see this in people with cardiac, who have compromised cardiac systems. They go into a cardiac rehab program, they grow more blood vessels. That is an enormously beneficial adaptation. The more blood vessels, the better. Okay, and you've all had your blood pressure measured, right? Right? Go to there, get your blood pressure measured, right? Systolic over diastolic. So basically your heart contracts, relaxes, contracts, relaxes, contracts, relaxes, contracts, relaxes. When it contracts, that's systolic. Your heart is pumping out the blood. Diastolic is where it's relaxing. So it beats, fills, beats, fills, beats, fills, beats, fills, beats, fills. Make sense? So when we take your blood pressure, we're looking at these two numbers. What's the blood pressure in your cardiovascular system when the heart is working, when it's squeezing blood out? And what's the pressure when it's relaxing in between beats? So we look at those two pressures. So basically this changed, a whole bunch of people became hypertensive overnight. And part of that was because they changed the criteria. It turns out that even modest increases in resting, and that's a big important thing here, resting blood pressure, that your heart rate, that your risk of cardiovascular disease goes up. So normal blood pressure is where the systolic is less than 120 and the diastolic is less than 80. And you can see that we have varying degrees of hypertension. But this is the big one that we really look at, is if your systolic is over 140 and or the diastolic is over 90, this is very serious. And you will have people where they are in crisis. I had a student, and this was in my 143 class a few semesters ago. We were doing a little thing, we were taking their blood pressure in the morning. And so one student took his blood pressure and it was I think it was 215 over like 126. And I'd never taken a blood pressure that high. I mean, I've been doing this for like, 40 years, right? So I thought, oh, clearly, I'm out to lunch. So I took it again. I took it manually. Wow, it's really hot. And so I took it a third time and it was still there. So I had a student escort the student to the student health center. They took it and it was also quite high on there. That is time for a stroke. So it turns out that this student knew that he was hypertensive, but had not followed his doctor's orders because he didn't have the funding for the medication that he needed. He was in serious risk of stroke. So we definitely don't want to have him exercise, because when you exercise, your blood pressure goes up. That makes sense? So I would never put that student in harm's way. Well, apparently I did, not knowing that his blood pressure was so high. Anyway, so we're always looking for that systolic to be less than, and by the way, these are resting blood pressures, not exercise. Resting blood pressures. Okay.
And I think on that note, why this is very important is because, as we have been talking about the entire semester, 4 weeks now, right? 4 weeks? 3rd week? 4th week? 3rd week? 4th week, yeah. 4th week is that, you know, you get to, the majority of us are going to start working with the general population. With our ultimate goal, for some of us, our athletes are going to be people that are performing at a high level, right, or higher level, okay, or a level that we would like, right, put them through, you know, pretty intense exercises or training programs. But this is important because, just like as Ellen mentioned, somebody doesn't disclose, or you didn't take the proper steps to identify that somebody has, you know, a condition, you know, high blood pressure. My parents, they're like, no, I just did it, I'm good. You know, I don't have high blood pressure. I'm like, wait a minute. But don't you take your high blood pressure? Oh yeah, I take it, but it's fine. Like, I mean, if I know, right? But if I'm gonna send it to, you know, to Kaya to train, you know, they should be able to, or they should disclose that, or Kaya should have the tools to be able to identify or to ask those questions, pertinent questions, so that we don't go into a situation where that was presented, Ellen. I mean, at 24-Hour Fitness, the number of times that we had to call ambulances, and I didn't know as much as I know now about this, but one of the main reasons was because people with high blood pressure, elevated all the time, and they didn't disclose that they were taking medication, beta blockers, you know, to their trainers. I mean, and how scary is that for you? You know, you're not a trained emergency professional. You have to have your CPR and AED certification, but that's about it. But if you're training someone, you're like into your training and somebody just collapses, you know. So we need to be aware of that, you know. And it's a lot of work up front, you know, to get somebody going in their training regimens. But it's the difference between life and death, truthfully.
Yeah, it really is. So with blood pressure, equal opportunity. Don't think of it as an old person's disease. We have plenty of
Yep.
young people here at City College. 1 out of 3 American adults is hypertensive. 1 out of 3. So don't say that this is, you know, well, it'll happen later on or something. It's just that, you know, we live in a world where, you know, our cardiovascular systems get assaulted a lot. There's a genetic component to it. There are no symptoms. It's not like Anton had a headache yesterday. Oh my gosh, maybe I have high blood pressure. There are no symptoms. You would not know. Many people find out they're hypertensive when they go to the dentist, right? They're going to have something like an oral surgery. They do their blood pressure. And it's like, it's through the roof, right? White coat syndrome, right? Oh my God, you know. So anyway, so the bottom line is that this is something that as we start to talk about assessments, you'll be learning, how would you know if your client had hypertension before you ever put them through any kind of exercise training program? Okay, and so we'll learn how to assess that.
Okay.
All right. So
Great.
one thing, this weekend, get your blood pressure taken. You can go to CVS, you can go to any of those places. They always have little blood pressure machines. Go ahead and get that taken.
Do not take mine on Sunday. Okay. Everybody get up, just stretch out. We've been sitting down for a little bit. So just stretch out 30 seconds. All right. So. have you guys been-
Oxygenate that body.
Oxygenated, that's true. So as Ellen had mentioned, the system supplies the body with oxygen, right? And the respiratory system main purpose or focus is gas exchange. So oxygen in, CO2 out. It happens at the alveoli, which is the little sacs. They look like grapes in the lungs. And that is where the capillaries that Ellen just alluded to or mentioned was that those are the ones that are going to be where the gas exchange happens. Okay, and if you have a safe and effective training cardiorespiratory training program, you will be able to elicit those adaptations from your body. Okay, so it picks it up, right? It picks up oxygen from the lungs, takes it all the way down through. Okay, and then here was another thing that Ellen mentioned. So with the heart rate, so it has to pump really, really hard. In the systolic, right, left ventricle, not only because it has to carry it over to the tissues and everywhere, but also it has to help with the return process. So remember that in terms of picking up critical components of the respiratory system. So some of the muscles and the respiratory pump, the bones, obviously the sternum, ribs, vertebrae, right? Inspiration muscles. So that's the diaphragm. Okay, really, really important. Okay, that's what's going to separate the lungs and the respiratory cavity from the digestive cavity. Okay, it's external intercostals, scalenes, right in here, right? So a lot of times we don't think about these as helping us out with breathing, but it does. It really helps. Sternocleidomastoid, probably my favorite word of anatomy, and your pectoralis minor. It is.
I got extra credit in high school for sternocleidomastoid. I've never forgotten it since. I said, what's this muscle? I turned to her head and I went, it's sternocleidomastoid.
Yep.
Ding, 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 ding. That was worth my extra credit for.
And then the expiration muscles, right? The internal intercostals, right? That's the muscles between the ribs and the abdominals. So belly breathing, very important, right? A lot of us don't do belly breathing. So here's a little anatomy of the respiratory system, right? It starts in the nose, right? It goes in, has to be, it gets, I call it the concha, into your nose, has all those little nose hairs, right? To trap some of that dust, anything that might be in that we don't want to go into the lungs. Try to filter some of that stuff out. Okay, and then it moistens and warms up the air that we inspire. So when kind of like now, right? When I go to Vegas, right? My mother-in-law has her AC, and my nose gets really, really dry, right? Because it's taking a lot of that moisture from the air, right? The AC. And because of COVID, I would wear, and now I wear a mask 24/7 almost. And that really helped. And I was just like, it was one of those aha moments, right? Like, oh, that's why, because there's some moisture and there's some warm into our in our nasal cavity. So then it goes into the pharynx, the back of the throat. Okay, there's the epiglottis, right, that separates from the esophagus into the trachea. The trachea here has some cartilage, right, and the cartilage is mainly for support of that trachea, so it doesn't collapse. Think about it like a vacuum hose, right? So if you have a vacuum hose that is very flimsy, it's going to collapse, right? So and so we want to make sure that we cannot collapse that trachea because we need that to breathe. So then it goes into the trachea with the windpipe. Right before that, the trachea, there's the larynx, where's the voice box, right? Every time we breathe or we swallow, the epiglottis closes down, so nothing goes into the trachea. Only air goes in there. right? And in the trachea, there's little cilia that they're hair-like, and there's also mucus that lines up, and it catches anything that didn't get trapped in the upper nasal cavity. It gets trapped in here, right? And in there, as I was coming over here, in the nasal cavity, there's lysozymes, right, which are killing bacteria. So Lysol, perfect name, right, for individuals. So when you breathe stuff in, right, unfortunately right now, COVID, right, you breathe it in, okay, your system has lysosomes to try to protect it, okay. Then it goes into the bronchioles or bronchi, right? Two big trees, left side, only 2 lobes into the lung. The right side has 3. And then it goes right into the bronchioles, which is even smaller, right? And then the alveoli, okay, which is this little sac. I remember them as like grape sacs, grape scent, sorry. And so that is where that's pretty much where everything happens in terms of oxygen exchange. There's about 500 million of these in your lungs. Okay, so that is where things were getting affected when we were taught as we going through COVID. This is where it was at. Okay, lots of mucus. Okay, because there was a lot of bacteria trying to fight it, off, but there was no gas exchange. So that's why your oxygenation levels, when people go in, decrease, because there was not enough gas exchange happening at those levels. Okay.
Did any of you during COVID, there was a period where we were all checking our pulse oxygen? Did any of you do that? Or pulse oximeter? I'll bring one in on Thursday. Because I have to get one. But it's a little finger device, and it measures the amount of oxygen in your blood. For most of us, we're in the 90s, right? Your blood is really saturated with oxygen, right? So we're usually in the high 90s,
Right.
like 96, 97.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then as soon as you start going down, then that's when you have to be, you have to make sure that you seek medical attention if you can't, breathe. So what happens in the cells? How do we use it? So essentially, when we bring in oxygen, right, our muscles contract, diaphragm contracts, tries to expand the cavity so that there's more pressure, there's less pressure in there, right? And then once it's trying to explore or bring out the oxygen or the air, it actually relaxes. So it goes back in. So the amount of oxygen that the lungs can diffuse to the bloodstream, plus the heart's ability to deliver the oxygen to the cells to process the oxygen. So essentially what it is that your lungs come in, there's too much oxygen in the lungs. There's not enough oxygen in the blood, so it tends to diffuse into from the lung into the bloodstream. Okay, and then your body, when there is so for example, let's say you're running, right? So you're using a lot of energy, you're using a lot of oxygen. Okay, there's a lot of CO2 getting produced. So now the blood comes through, grabs that CO2, takes it up to the lungs, so where it exposes it, and then once you're in the once it comes back into the to the tissues, then you can go ahead and grab that oxygen from the blood. Okay, abnormal breathing patterns. We talked a little bit about that. Bradyapnea, right? Less than 8 breaths per minute. When I was in EMT school, this was something that was like huge, because you had to make sure that you were taking your pulse, people's pulses, taking their breathing rate. You had to know all that stuff. So obviously for us, we don't need to be like on it, right? Like, oh, are they breathing? They're not breathing. how fast are they breathing? You know, which is what you want to know. You want to be in the know. Okay, know some of these terms. This dyspnea, so it's labor breathing, hyperventilations, which can lead to dizziness and fainting. So when sympathetic nervous system, right? So what happens when you have to flight, right? A lot of times people go into hyperventilation. So there's not enough time for the gases to exchange. So therefore, your body starts going, whoa, whoa, whoa. So it starts to get dizzy, and then that's when it faints. It's a safety mechanism for your body. Okay. Kyphosis, right? So people, especially in the elder population, and I don't know. Ellen just mentioned it. Us, look at us when we sit down. Kyphosis, right? So it's we are seeing it more and more often in younger populations, where it used to be at the later stages in life. Now we're seeing more sooner for sure. So that does, it decreases that lung capacity because now you're crouched. Okay. One of the things, diaphragmatic breathing, where you actually in through your nose, expand the abdomen, right? Intra-abdominal pressure. Intra-abdominal pressure. Does anybody that lifts or use that technique? Okay. So
In 143, we call it bracing.
Bracing.
Right, so to increase the intra-abdominal pressure helps to stabilize the spine.
Right, from the inside to the outside, right? So that's the way you want to look at it. So diaphragmatic breathing, which you should do, okay, it feels really, really good, okay? A lot of times we don't, because society, has taught us like, oh, nice and tight and everything, right? But you should be able to breathe, or you're not able, but you should breathe through your nose into your abdomen. Okay, relax that. Make sure that diaphragm, contracts. Okay, and then also pushes everything out, because there's only so much space in here that where you can have. Anything else, Ellen? Before I think that was the only thing that I.
Only thing I did forget to mention, I have to go back to the capillary real quick, and I'm sorry, I just realized nobody can see this. Can you give me a picture? Can you just put the lights on in the back? I forgot to tell you, in the capillaries are so small that red blood cells can only go through single file, right? It's like a one-way street. So they're so small that these have to go through single file. So just like traffic, this is like bumper to bumper traffic, right? So when it's bumper to bumper traffic, it's slow, right? So oxygen that's on the red blood cell can get into the cell, and CO2 that's in the muscle can get back to the red blood cell. So that's how you have that exchange take place, because it's, everything is slowed down, right? Because it's so crowded in there, right? Single file only. Okay. And the only thing I would say is try breathing like this. And see how much you can expand your lungs, and then stand up nice and tall. And you'll see that difference in the lung capacity. Questions on anything? Okay, so we got through two of those. So on Thursday, we're going to be looking at the endocrine system and the digestive system, and then we'll be done with kind of the overall human body. And then we start moving into assessment and then exercise prescription. Okay. On that note, have a great rest of the day. We'll see you on Thursday. Make sure everybody gets some kind of a high five, an elbow, a recognition on a job well done. Come with questions. Questions are always good. And then we're going to post this today. By the way, we posted lab 3. It's due next week. I'm going to post lab 4, which is on the endocrine and digestive system. That'll be due at the same time. It'll come out of these two. This powerful. All right. Okay, have a great rest of the day, everybody.